behalf of the Werkleitz Festival 2021, I'm gladly hosting Desiree Förster for the New World dis/oder podcast series. My name is Marold Langer-Philippsen.
I also was very intrigued by the concept of metabolism because usually we only know it from the context of sports or nutrition. But for me, I'm very interested in the relations between humans and the environments, between humans and non-humans. For me, the term of metabolism was a way to really zoom into these interrelations between us and our surrounding, and to examine how we make meaning on levels that are not necessarily available to our conscious reflection, because our body is constantly adapting to our surrounding. We are usually not necessarily aware of it. And I was especially interested in the way art and aesthetics approach this relationality that I see between us and our surrounding, because they really propel us towards attention and attentiveness towards things that happen without our conscious. In my dissertation that was titled Aesthetics of Metabolic Processes, I looked at different installations and art pieces that would use the atmosphere around us, tweak the atmosphere, change the atmosphere in such a way that these interrelations between us and our surrounding that we usually do not sense or are not aware of would be intensified in such a way that certain effects would be produced, intensities would be produced that we can actually feel and then also reflect upon. I see artistic practices really as able to create certain aesthetic milieus that intensify relations that are always already there. But because they are intensified in these milieus, we become able to sense them and to reflect upon them. And so I don't think that it's coming back to a certain sensitivity, but it's rather a way of learning a new sensitivity, becoming more attentive, developing new practices of attention within these aesthetic milieus, which is also in part due to novel digital technologies that allow us to create these aesthetic milieus and find representations of these metabolic interrelations that I'm interested in, that we otherwise would not really have the ability to grasp in any other way. What is important is always in this context that to know and to remember that every kind of representation, every kind of concept that we have of us, of the world, is always a construction. It's always just something like to help us to deal with the world, to create and recreate a meaningful relationship to the world. We always think that digital information is always ahead of us in a certain way. We have to be, of course, very careful about, because digital environments can nudge us in certain directions without us being even aware of it. And then we become part of capitalist structures. We might want to gain a more reflective stance on the way how digital environments impact our decision making. And for that, I think aesthetic milieus that heighten our sensitivity for how we are always impacted and always affected by our environments on a pre-conscious, pre-reflective level can actually help us to make differently informed decisions and to also account for what we actually not know. And the non-human is also, speaking about concepts and how we use concepts to make sense of the world. The non-human is also such a concept that has been already criticized. A lot of scholars say we should find a different term in order to address that, which is not human or more than human. In my book, I use the term non-human to address not only vegetal environments or atmospheric processes, materialities that we find in our world that we use or relate to in different ways, but I also think about the non-human as something that is actually in ourselves, like non-human processes that happen in ourselves that are part of our metabolism that we are not really aware of, that do not really fit into this very humanistic view of the human subject as being the subject that refers to an object that can know something about objects and that is basically identified with ability to reflect, to consciously decide and be an autonomous subject in the world. And so I would use this term of the non-human also to to point towards the multiplicity within the human. The non-human are also the technological entanglements in which we find ourselves in. The tools that help us to make sense of the world. I am myself in a certain non-human entanglement with my computer. It helps me think, it helps me organize my knowledge, it helps me to memorize things. So I would also address that as the non-human. But the non-human is more than that. I think the non-human is something that really helps us to question what we understand as being human. Thinking with the non-human about the human shows us that the human is actually not this autonomous subject. We always find ourselves in interrelations with surroundings on multiple levels. And one level is the technological level. Another level is that we are breathing the surrounding air that we are sharing with other entities as well. And in my book, I especially look at this aspect of what does it mean to become aware that we are sharing the same atmosphere with other non-human entities, and that I'm actually depending on these non-human entities in order to maintain like more or less healthy status within that environment. This line of thought that I'm interested in starts with a critique of substance ontologies, which go back to Plato and Descartes. And substance ontologies underlie the way how we perceive the world today in the Western world and how we do science in the Western world. The thing about substance ontologies is that they understand entities as primary elements. That means they exist prior to any interaction or relation with other entities. And I think that this is highly problematic and does not really help us to understand what is happening in the world today, because these ways of theorizing the subject as being opposed to the object is the base of inequality and is not helpful to really deal with climate change, for example. And so I was getting very interested in process philosophies, because process philosophies, as for example, one beautifully formulated by Alfred North Whitehead, they address the problematic in substance ontologies and saying what the substance ontologies describe, namely that there is a subject as opposed to an object, is something that happens much, much later in our experience. It is something that happens in a phase of our experience when we already constructed this subjective position opposed to an object. And people like Whitehead and also William James before that, they were very interested in what happens actually before that. What happens in experience before we create this subjective position? And Whitehead criticized this form of addressing the objective world as something that we can reduce to certain perceivable qualities as the bifurcation of nature. And Whitehead, his philosophy offers an ontological framework to describe materiality as relational and as composed of concrete processes. And he opposes the separation of essence and perceivable qualities that is fundamental to substance ontologies. And instead, he assumes that our perception of the world is the outcome of an ongoing relational process in which we as perceivers and the world as that which we perceive come together in experience. And he developed this term of prehension, which is his tweak of the term apprehension. And prehension is something that can also be described as like a blind feeling. And prehension is something that happens basically on an experiential process before conscious thought. It happens in all kinds of entities, like a stone prehends his environment, just like I prehend my mobile phone. And it is a process in which things come together in experience. I, as the prehending entity, take what I prehend into my own composition. It becomes part of me, basically. And this is a very complex but very beautiful philosophy and ontology that leads everything back to the processual base. So everything is a process for Whitehead. And I was very intrigued by that because I was wondering, how can we find and describe an aesthetics that is able to grasp this processual, this process at the base of our experience? Because usually aesthetics shows objects, right? Objects that we can look at, that we can appreciate as something beautiful. But how can we develop an aesthetics that allows us to become attentive to this processuality at the base of our experience? Like atmospheres, because atmospheres like clouds constantly change. You can take a picture of a cloud and then you have a fixed object, but the cloud as it is constantly changes, moves, prehends its environment, prehends the saturation of the air around it, is in this constant process of becoming. And how can we get familiar with that? And to come back to this question about attention or awareness, there is actually a very beautiful term in German, which is like Aufmerksamkeit. And Aufmerksamkeit, part of that word is something like when you notice something. And I was interested in understanding how we can engage in processes in an aesthetic way. So, for example, encounter in immersive environments clouds around us that change. We can feel them, we can smell the air. And how can we become familiar with something so unfamiliar? How can we learn about these very unhuman processes in the atmosphere and the climate that surrounds us, and become familiar with the effects that they have on our own body? And this is what I mean with sensitivity or heightened sensitivity for metabolic processes, because we actually learn how our body is able to sense its surrounding, how our body is able to prehend, to feel a cloud without necessarily being able to become the cloud or to know the cloud as in the sense of a scientific object, to learn what are the relations we are already always find ourselves in. According to Whitehead, prehension happens all the time on all levels of experience. It happens on the level of our cells, it happens on the level of our mental reasoning. And usually we cannot become really aware of these processes because our conscious awareness is just a product of that. And what fascinates me about this term in thinking about this question of how we can become more sensitive towards these processes that embed us in the world is that it opens a door to look at how meaning is produced before we reflect on it. How, for example, our body is constantly engaging and trying to compose a meaningful relationship to its environment. If I'm standing on a platform waiting for my train and there's a dark rain cloud approaching me, then what I think about that, how I estimate how much time do I have until it starts to rain. All these conscious reflections are one thing that I can be aware of, but there's also something that happens in our body that creates a certain alertness towards what is happening in our surrounding. And that is what I'm interested in. Like, how can we become more sensitive to these processes of meaning making that happen in our body constantly before we even reflect upon it? And how can we avoid trying to make sense of that immediately? Because I think what we need in order to engage with the challenges like climate change and other immense challenges that we are facing today is in part to avoid trying to have like a certainty immediately. We have to learn to deal with indeterminacy. We have to learn to accept and deal with non-conscious processes or processes that we can just not grasp, processes that are too far from our everyday experience, like, for example, in climate change. What do we want to be there in the future? What do we want to save? And of course, also the question, like, from what do we want to save it? This is a highly ethical question because we have to decide what matters. Which kind of species do we want to protect from extinction? Which kinds of peoples matter? And there we see that the world is just, the reality that we are living in is much more complicated and multiple than we can really understand and conceptualize with these tools that we have at hand. Because again, like the question is, what will we account for? What do we decide matters in these contexts? This is something where I think that humanities scholars like me have really the task to pose these questions and to point towards the fact that things are being left out. Like whenever we define something as being worth to survive, worth to be insured, we leave out something else. And we have to be aware of that. On the other hand, my recent work, I'm thinking a lot about crises and how aesthetics can help us to navigate crises. And I want to understand crises not as something like an event that is terminated, something that we just have to go through, and after that we will return to some kind of normal, like the COVID pandemic, for example. We just have to wait a few more months until everybody is inoculated and we will be returning to some new normal. I think that is a mistake because we have to understand that crisis is something that is part of our experience of the world. And we have to find ways to navigate crises in a way that we understand that we are constantly changing, and we have to constantly change, and we have to take the events like the COVID pandemic as a chance to understand what has to change, what kind of potentialities in the present have we not considered yet for a possible and maybe better future, but at least a different future, right? Which also brings me then to speculative research, which is something that is very much at the core of my own scholarly work as well. And here it's interesting to think about speculative research or speculative philosophy as opposed to speculation, because speculation is very much related to this question of insurance. What do we insure? Because it tries to foresee a possible future and to inform subjects at present about how to act in order to get the best benefits in the end. And speculative research couldn't be more opposed to that, because speculative research, as developed by Martin Safransky and Didier Debes, goes more into the direction of speculative philosophy, but also Whitehead is a speculative philosopher. They see the task of speculative research more in really finding these unseen potentialities in the present, to understand time not as something linear where one thing has to follow the next, but rather as something crumbled, as something folded, where we have to just find ways to speculate about ways of being in the world that might be able then to also account for others that we have left out of these future imaginaries so far. I think that what is important is really to develop alternative ways of perceiving being in the world, how we address phenomena like climate change, that we have to understand that these concepts of nature and the wild, we have to ask ourselves, where do these concepts come from? And how do they manifest in the views of our world? And how do they impact our actions? And are they still adequate? Do we find different kinds of representations and concepts? We also have to learn to not see the non-human or digital environments as beyond the social, but instead ask us how these cultural understandings of inhabitation, ownership, and rights over such environments have been historically constructed, and also question whose interests have been served by these constructions. We have to learn to address the environment and the human as part of larger complexes of which scientific decisions, cultural practices are part of. We also have to learn to tell different stories, and people like Donna Haraway and Anna Tsing have shown how we can tell stories that enliven the agilities of the non-humans and how we can practice modes of attention. Of course, also aesthetic practices can help us to develop different sensitivities towards the world. But I think one important part in defining different concepts that describe our reality and how we relate to the world is also to question our vocabulary and speaking about that. Because, as I mentioned earlier, the way how we perceive the world goes back to substance ontologies. You can see how ingrained that is in the way we speak, because we always have a subject, a verb, and an object. That is what makes a sentence. If we want to think processual about that, then we have to somehow find a way to speak about what happens before the subject and the object are even created. What happens outside of this structure of the subject, word, object, and predicate. That's definitely a task for me as a humanities scholar, to think about not only different concepts and making important distinctions and pointing towards where these concepts that we are using coming from and whom they serve, but to also think about how can we actually talk about what happens in the world differently. To develop, but also look at what is already there, because there are native languages, indigenous practices that approach the world very differently, where the subject plays a very different role compared to our Western understanding. And looking at other cultures where there's millions of words for snow, for example, I think we can learn a lot about sensitivities towards climatic phenomena. I think that is a very important task also, to become learners again, to become open to practices that are much older than ours, and to learn how we think differently about the world, our role in the world, and to speak about that as well. And maybe not even to speak, to play with it as well. Like, what kind of practices of play can we develop that help us to find different sensitivities towards what is going on. If I go into an installation, I'm basically becoming open to be surprised. That's what I expect if I enter an installation. So there's already a different context that is created that makes me more open. In my book, I'm describing this encounter with an installation by Philipp Rahm, who is an architect. As a beautiful example for the way how aesthetic milieus can really shift our attention to processes that happen internally in our bodies and how our body makes meaning. Because when you enter this installation, when you enter this space, there's nothing to see. It's just a white room. There are like solar panels on the floor. Everything else is white, no objects, nothing. What Philipp Rahm did is that he changed the atmosphere of this place in such a way that the oxygen levels and the temperatures equal an alpine region, something very high up. And under normal circumstances, people would feel symptoms of altitude sickness within just a few minutes. And what I find so fascinating about this piece is that you enter the space, there's nothing to see, but the longer you stay, you start realizing that your body is doing something. You start realizing, oh, maybe my breathing is getting a little bit higher. I feel like a sense of nervousness. I feel more agitated, which are like symptoms of altitude sickness. And a very simple piece with a very strong impact, I believe, because it really shifts our awareness towards what is actually happening. And the art piece, the object of appreciation, becomes our body and how it deals with changes in the atmospheric surrounding. I think what we have to learn is enrich our feelings in different ways, which is also something that I'm taking from Whitehead. We need different experiences. We need to become sensitive for the possibilities of feeling differently, of being differently in the world, which I think is beautiful, because that also means that things do not have to be the way they are right now. There are so many unaccountable different forms of relating to our surroundings. And in these terms, like there's many things that we can do, but looking at indigenous practices, native practices, and how they have over much longer time than us learned to navigate, to correspond with nature, for example. What we need are encounters with different cultures and different ways of thinking as well. We need to find different ways of collaborating across disciplines, across cultures. And art can be a beautiful platform for that. There's, for example, this amazing game that I started playing during the pandemic, which is called Never Alone. It's a beautiful computer game that was developed in collaboration with native peoples from Alaska. It basically translates the storytelling culture of these peoples into a game structure. And it's narrated in the original language of this tribe and about being told stories like oral history that are very important for these peoples. You are basically this girl that meets a spirit fox, and together they try to understand where the cold wind comes from that destroyed the girl's village. And so you're walking through this icy landscape. There's a lot of collaboration. Without the fox, for example, the girl would never reach its goal. And there's a lot of dying in this game as well. So it's also like learning not to live, but also to die with others, which I find a very interesting way of thinking and approaching also different imaginaries for future cohabitation, right? Like, how do we die well together? I think like collaborations like that led to an aesthetic art piece, a game like this, are extremely important to understand how we make meaning of the world now and what we might account for in the future in order to make different kinds of meanings.
This was Desiree Förster in a podcast by Werkleitz Festival 2021 about PREHENSIONS time.